Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session on embodied carbon and certifications and commitments. On behalf of the Boston Society for Architecture, I'd like to thank you for joining the Embodied Carbon 101 series, which is a 12-part program series taking place this summer. The series has been bringing you embodied carbon programming throughout the summer, providing foundational knowledge in different impact areas and giving you tools and takeaways that you can apply to your everyday work. I am Maureen Mahle. I'm the Managing Director of Sustainable Housing Services at Stephen Winter Associates, and I'll be your presenter here today. Stephen Winter Associates is a research, consulting, and advisory services firm, and we specialize in energy efficiency, sustainability, and accessibility. I would also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this series, which includes Arc Woods and Services, Goody Clancy, Huber Engineered Woods, Kingspan, Nordic Structures, Select Building Products, and Thought Forums. We're very grateful for your support. I would also like to thank our partners, Built Environment Plus, the International Living Future Institute, and the Structural Engineering Institute. And I'd also like to recognize that this program series is sponsored by the Carbon Leadership Forum and its local knowledge community, CLF Boston, which we invite you to join if you're interested. Before we dive in, a couple of notes about this program. If you are interested and eligible, there's one learning unit of HSW that's available for those who qualify, and we will share a link to a Google form in the chat box. So if you follow that link to the Google form and you would like continuing education credit, you can add your name, your email address, and your AIA number there. If you're not an AIA number, but you still want the certificate for other purposes, please enter your name and your email address. We are recording this session and it will be posted on the BSA website, architects.org, later this week for you to access. Throughout the presentation, you're welcome to submit any questions, and we ask that you do that using the Q&A function in the Zoom menu. I might not be able to address them all today, but BSA will use them to inform future programming and resources. And again, all of this will be recorded, so there will be a record of those. And with that, let's begin. So I'd like to share with you an overview of what I plan to share today, which is, first of all, a brief introduction to why embodied carbon impacts are showing up in certification programs and commitments, from the project to the local to the global scale. Followed by the bulk of the presentation will be an overview of the programs and initiatives, including those listed here. So the ones I have in orange are commitments. The ones in green are green building certification programs. The ones in blue are energy-specific certification programs, and those in purple are health-focused certification programs. I come to this from the residential point of view, although I am hoping to share this in a format that applies to all building project types. And then the final thing I want to touch on in my closing is to address how we can build a process for addressing embodied carbon in pursuit of these certifications or commitments. Since you've been following this series, I think this is probably something you are quite familiar with already, but so that we can gain some perspective for why these certifications and commitments exist, let's just review some of the scary facts about embodied carbon. It starts with the pace of construction globally, and the fact that based on the UN Environment Global Status Report from 2017, it's predicted that we are essentially adding a new New York City to the planet every 34 days for the next 40 years. So it's an incredible amount of construction that's happening. And Architecture 2030 has done a really great job of giving us some visuals and resources that also describe this and show that building materials and construction count for 11% overall of the global carbon emissions by sector. The embodied impacts of materials, the growing body of knowledge around this, essentially says we cannot net zero our way out of this program. And so what we're trying to do is increase the awareness of our clients, building occupants, other decision makers and stakeholders to realize that embodied greenhouse gas impacts are becoming increasingly significant. It actually becomes even more true, of course, as we reduce our operating carbon, which we have a pretty good handle on how to do. So we're now needing to turn our attention to the embodied impacts. So let's dive into the certifications and commitments that we're reviewing. We'll be talking about Architecture 2030 and SE 2050, LEED, a couple of options provided by the Institute, the Living Building Challenge and the Zero Carbon certification from ILFI, the National Green Building Standard, which is the residential counterpart to the International Green Construction Code, Enterprise Green Communities, Energy Star and its partner program, Zero Energy Ready Homes, and Passive House, as well as the Well Building Standard and Fitwell. Let's start by talking about Architecture 2030, which truly has, as stated in their mission statement, really has provided leadership around this issue. It started in 2002 with a focus on energy and greenhouse gases, but they've done a wonderful job of retooling to address this growing body of knowledge and the growing concern around embodied carbon. So they've really restated the mission to say achieving zero carbon emissions and talking about new buildings as well as embodied carbon and existing buildings. So they're putting out information in a digestible format with graphics like the following that shows that between 2020 and 2050, if we continue to practice business as usual, we can expect to see the percentage of carbon emissions coming from embodied carbon at essentially half. So basically equal to operational carbon, which is a sobering fact. And that's why Architecture 2030, among its many initiatives, has launched several that are focused very specifically on embodied carbon. So as to my knowledge, this started with the 2030 Challenge for Products that came out around 2011. Of course, the organization is also co-running what used to be called the Embodied Carbon Network, now the Carbon Leadership Forum Community. And then there's a couple of tools that I'm going to touch on briefly here, including the Carbon Smart Materials Palette and the EPD Quicksheet. So the Carbon Smart Materials Palette is a way to get some great visualizations, and I see it primarily as an education tool, not just for designers, but also for their clients, to look at specific materials and explore the alternatives. I mean, I personally am just very impressed by graphics like this that really break down an entire life cycle into, a nice, understandable visual. So it's a wonderful resource and one that I encourage all of you to explore further. Another one of the resources is the EPD Quicksheet. So that, of course, is Environmental Product Declaration. And this is a way to streamline the information found in these declarations. EPDs, of course, are essentially the miles per gallon stickers, if you will, for a given product to describe, what its various climate impacts might be, expressed in things like the global warming, ozone depletion, acidification, eutrophication, smog creation, etc. So one of the things that becomes challenging on a project is that the information can be presented different ways by different manufacturers, and this is essentially a way to sort of streamline, pull out the relevant pieces and have them in a similar format so that you can kind of more easily compare apples to apples for a given selection that you're making between product choices. So just to sum up, we've got a variety of tools, resources, as well as the overall commitment from Architecture 2030. And it really sets the stage, I think, and offers that leadership for where the rest of the green and energy efficiency industry can go. Sort of a maybe similar initiative is actually coming from the structural engineering sector with SE 2050, which is committing to net zero, and they are describing themselves as a community of progressive structural engineers who are endorsing a global vision of net zero carbon building. So some of the things that they are offering, and this by the way started around 2016, one of the things they're offering is the ECOM, the Embodied Carbon Order of Magnitude, a very simple calculator for structural materials, and I've got a screenshot of that coming up. They also have some embodied carbon intensity diagrams, and they're working on some benchmarking and project comparisons, and they're planning to have opportunities to upload project data coming soon. It seems to me that a lot of this is still under development, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what they're able to produce. But one of the things that's definitely available right now is the tool that's shown here, which kind of lets you just look based on an area usage of a given material and compare one to another and look at the embodied carbon impacts and intensities of a different material options. So it's a great estimator tool for that high level analysis that you might want to do very early in a project. There also are a couple of embodied carbon intensity diagrams available, but I think some of these are still forthcoming. There was a steel decking one, but some of the other options I wasn't able to find at the current moment. So as I'm going through, I'm using my own super informal starring system, which is just to offer some indication of, in these resources, sort of like how much is available. So at this moment in time, I think there's slightly more developed from Architecture 2030. So I've given them 3 stars, and we'll work our way down the list and see how each of these sort of stack up. So the next one that I want to talk about is LEED. Now, LEED in its basic iteration, starting back with the original version in 1998 up until essentially 2013, it addressed embodied carbon kind of indirectly, talking about and giving projects credit for building reuse, reclaimed, reuse, or recycled content, as well as local materials, construction waste management, etc. But they didn't sort of address it more explicitly until a pilot credit that I believe was introduced in 2012, when they first started to recognize life cycle assessment, or LCA tools. And then in 2013 came LEED version 4, where we suddenly saw a restructuring of the entire materials category, and it included credits around building life cycle impact reduction, which they divided into a building and material reuse sections, more similar to the old version of LEED, as well as this new idea based on the pilot credit around whole building life cycle analysis. And they were asking projects to show a 10% reduction compared to a baseline building in at least 3 out of 6 different impact categories, and one of those must include global warming potential. So this required, of course, the use of an LCA calculator. And I reached out to the folks in my firm who had done this type of work to just to sort of get a sense of how many of their projects are participating in this, as well as what the costs might be. And in very rough terms, they indicated that the cost for a full LCA, including that early analysis, might be on the order of $10,000 per project. Certainly could be much less or potentially much more. And some of the tools that project teams are commonly using include Tally, or One-Click LCA. The one that we happen to use at Stephen Winter Associates is One-Click LCA. And while it seems to be an achievable credit for the projects that are interested, we have yet to see a very large number of projects opting in for the full LCA credit. So it's definitely an option, and one we're doing our best to encourage, but it's not yet necessarily in maybe the mainstream of all projects pursuing LEED. So along came version 4.1 of LEED. In general, the market had pushback to LEED version 4, and there were some lessons learned and some improvements that were made. Many of them in the material resources category, probably more heavily focused on some of the health-related impacts, but also on some of these building life cycle impact reductions. So in April of 2019, we saw some edits to LEED in the form of V4.1, and even V4 projects can opt in to using 4.1 credits through credit substitutions. So what they did was they basically broke this out into more options. Instead of only having the option to do a whole building LCA, they offered some tiers. So you could earn credit for doing 5% as well as 10%. And they added an option for what I'll call a simple LCA or a hotspot level sort of pre-design analysis of the structural and enclosure elements only. So in terms of our experience with this pathway, we're finding that it is an impactful option, you know, especially when building size and structure type are being chosen, and you can have some influence early in the project design. Also gives you the ability to then set a benchmark, have the conversation, and really, you know, set some goals for embodied carbon intensity reduction. And if nothing else, it's a way to engage multiple parties of the team, including the structural engineer, the geotechnical engineer, the enclosure designer very early, and to have, you know, hopefully a meaningful conversation about what for many people is a newer consideration. We're definitely finding that the sort of simple version is of just looking at the structure and enclosures is more popular than the full LCA analysis, and the cost, you know, might be more or less, but maybe it's more on the order of a third or less of the cost of the full LCA. So that was one piece of the LEED credit. Now I'm going to talk about a different credit that shows up in both V4 and 4.1. And this has to do with those EPDs, the Environmental Product Declarations. This is under the Building Product Disclosure and Optimization section. And the credit as written in LEED V4, again, this was the first time that this showed up in the LEED rating systems, was recognizing any products that had EPDs. And what they were requiring specifically was to have at least 20 products from 5 different manufacturers that are either ISO compliant, there's a variety of ISO standards, or had cradle to gate EPDs. So they all needed to be third party. There's a number of different standards and criteria that are sort of wrapped into what makes a compliant EPD. This is achievable. It definitely takes some research effort, and so maybe it's not as attractive to some project teams, but generally speaking, this is something that many projects can pursue. But the EPDs is really just a matter of checking whether they exist. To encourage project teams to go even a level deeper, LEED included what they called the multi-attribute optimization, which was to really weight sort of those EPDs. So it's not just saying what's in it, it's also basically giving priority and more credit, as it were, to the most impactful selections. So while this was a wonderful idea, we found that generally speaking, it was quite difficult for projects to achieve in most of the projects that we were working on. So along came the 4.1 update again. So this was 5.5 years after LEED V4 was first introduced. So obviously the industry had made some headway and learned some things. And to the EPDs portion, there were some changes to how products are counted, giving whole point instead of quarter per product, etc. And then they also added several more ISO compliant standard options, which all serve to make this option more achievable. And in fact, many projects now are earning exemplary performance for having not just 20, but 40 or more compliant products. As far as the multi-attribute optimization, the one that in our experience had relatively little uptake, this was now separated into an action plan for manufacturers and then actual impact reductions that were achieved. So this was one way to maybe recognize both the intent of manufacturers working their way toward an improved impact scenario versus those that had already sort of gotten there to their reduction targets. So there's an option for 10 or more compliant products from 3 or more manufacturers. Instead of also having to do it by 50% cost, you have a choice. And the transparency part in particular, we're finding is definitely much more achievable now with the action plan. So another LEED credit is the product disclosure and optimization, the sourcing of raw materials. And here we're looking for raw material sourcing and extraction reporting, where there's 20 or more products from 5 or more manufacturers who are sort of publicly disclosing their extraction locations and committing to responsible practices along the way. This is one that, generally speaking, most of our projects are having a little bit of a tough time with. And then there's the leadership extraction processes, which requires that 20% of the products by cost are a combination of, for example, bio-based or naturally renewable, like wood, reused, recycled, or local within 100 miles. So this is essentially kind of lumping together a lot of the previous versions of LEED, a lot of their different credits. And this seems to be possible with some effort, especially because it kind of, rolls up those previous LEED materials credits that the industry was somewhat accustomed to. So in 4.1, there was actually a couple of big changes here. They got rid of that raw material source and extraction reporting, and they renamed the second option the responsible sourcing of raw materials. So they introduced 2 different tiers for either 20% or 40% of the total materials by cost. And then they changed the bio-based credit criteria for non-wood products slightly. And reused products were clarified to be worth 200% instead of 100%. So projects may only still earn the 1 point. That's probably the most common scenario. But with the V4.1 edits to this particular credit and these pathways, we're seeing higher potential to earn 2 points than we did under version 4. So this made this category also a bit more achievable. So speaking to LEED for homes, in general, LEED for homes continued to follow a more prescriptive approach, although they will allow substitution of any of the LEED credits that I just described from the BD&C rating system. But one of the things that was sort of unique in LEED V4 was their approach to construction waste management, which was the first time I'd seen in LEED where we'd introduced a per square foot limit on construction waste management. And even maybe more significantly, recycled materials still counted against you. They counted at 75% instead of 100% of materials sent to landfill. But it was still a pretty powerful incentive and signal to the market to flat out eliminate waste rather than focus on recycling. However, the market was perhaps not quite ready for that. And so they, along with 4.1, then there was also an earlier credit interpretation update. They essentially reverted to the approach that gives credit for a percentage of waste recycled. So you still have the option to do the sort of more aggressive credit, but it's no longer required. So that is LEED in a nutshell, and I will move on to talk a little bit about the International Living Future Institute and some of the things that they're offering specifically focused on embodied carbon. If you're familiar with the Living Building Challenge, you know that it sets a wonderful standard for sustainability. And within that, they also offer Petal certification for projects that perhaps can't do every category in Living Building Challenge, but wanted to do a deeper dive. And the materials Petal in particular allows projects to focus on things like embodied carbon. And then lastly, and probably most relevant to this discussion, is the zero carbon certification option. A couple other things that are offered by ILFI include the Declare products labels and also the Red List, which are the health focused materials initiatives, and living product certification as well, which is suitable for manufacturers to pursue. So this is a visual that kind of breaks down some of the different options that ILFI offers in terms of its certifications. And the one that we'll be talking about the most today is the Zero Carbon certification, but we'll also touch on the Living Building Challenge too. So the Zero Carbon certification essentially requires a few main things. It requires reductions in energy use and embodied carbon through design and construction techniques. Then, for whatever you aren't able to achieve, it basically requires net zero through the use of offsets, and those can be offsite. And like all of ILFI certifications, they're looking to verify after you have at least 12 months of post-occupancy data. So it really is a measured achievement. Here's a little more detail about those requirements. The energy reductions would be 25% for new or 30% for existing buildings from an ASHRAE 90.1 baseline, or there's also a budget, an EUI budget based on location. No projects can have combustion except for, there's an exception for existing buildings. And then, as well as the operational energy reduction, there's an embodied carbon reduction where we're looking for a 10% reduction compared to a baseline using some approved LCA tools. Those include Athena, Tally, One-Click LCA, and there's also a cap in place as well. Projects are required to be zero ready for on-site planning for future renewables. And then, of course, there's a one-time purchase for energy and carbon offsets through some approved vendors. And so they give some criteria for the various credentials and quality measures that any provider of those offsets would need to meet. The Living Building Challenge and the Petal certifications, I'm going to focus, primarily on the materials imperatives that would be sort of relevant to the carbon conversation. So under materials, in addition to no red list, so that's a health one, there's the responsible sourcing, use of third-party labels, including FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, NSC, which is the Natural Stone Council, or Declare. And then the living economy sourcing, which has to do with requiring different percentages of the project materials to come from these various radiuses, so to prioritize the use of local materials. And then one of the big ones is in order to earn a materials Petal, you would also have to have net positive waste. So if I were doing my informal ranking and sort of comparing these to one another in terms of the contributions they're making to this embodied carbon mission right now, I'm giving LEED 2 stars. It's got a lot in there, but I'm giving the Zero Carbon certification from ILFI 3 stars because it goes further. And those are the ones that we have kind of the deepest dive into, really. So I'm going to spend some time now talking about some of the other alternatives. And several of these are more residential focused. So depending on how much time you spend working in the residential sector, you may or may not be familiar, but there are also some relevant tools in there, even if maybe residential isn't all of the work that you do. So let me speak first to the International Green Construction Code. Where we see embodied carbon showing up is in Section 9, which is the building's impact on atmosphere and materials and resources. It's the things that we sort of have expected to see in our green building programs over the years, including attention to construction waste, the extracting, harvesting, and manufacturing of materials, responsible refrigerants, and the storage and collection of recyclables and discarded goods to make the building more waste management friendly during its operation. And then projects who are completing this section, and by the way, this section can be adopted by municipalities who adopt the International Green Construction Code, but there's always the chance that they wouldn't include it. So it's not necessarily a given. It depends on, how a different governing body has chosen to utilize this code. But in addition to those first ones, which were mandatory, you either need to do a prescriptive or a performance option to complete this section 9. And under the prescriptive option, it's again similar to what we've seen in programs like LEED over the years, which is the reduced impact materials, recycled content, regional, and bio-based. Or alternatively, instead of doing those, you could do a life cycle analysis option, and they're calling that the performance option. The National Green Building Standard, it has a relationship to IGCC in that it is the proxy for residential buildings. The standard, though, the NGBS, as we call it, also allows for optional green building certification of any residentially qualifying building, regardless of whether the code applies or not in a given jurisdiction. So it's NGBS is, I would say, a direct competitor to LEED for homes and LEED for multifamily. And I think it has many similarities in what it historically sort of recognizes in terms of waste management and the green materials. Where we started to see changes was really in the 2015 and 2020 versions of the standard, where for the first time we saw whole building life cycle analysis or a life cycle analysis option per product or assembly. And this is one that I have seen pretty limited uptake. I have seen a little bit on the per product basis, but so far my NGBS projects have not opted for the whole building LCA option, but it is available for them to pursue. Another program I wanted to mention is Enterprise Green Communities, and you might not be familiar with this unless you do work in affordable housing. If you do work in affordable housing, often I would say you almost certainly have some familiarity with this program because it's very often mandatory in many parts of the country. So this has been around since 2005, 2008. And there have been multiple iterations over the years. It initially bared a really striking resemblance to LEED for Homes, and still does in many ways. And it always had, again, sort of what I'll call the usual suspects as far as waste management, prioritizing local materials, giving credit for recycled content materials, and so on. What's most interesting to me is the 2020 version, which was just introduced this spring and actually goes into effect this coming fall in October. And I was very pleased to see that they renamed the energy efficiency category operating energy, which I think makes a helpful distinction to start to sort of retrain our minds and retrain our vocabulary around separating the difference between operating energy or operational carbon and embodied energy and embodied carbon. So that I think was an important distinction to make. That was one change. And then in the materials section under the environmentally responsible materials, they kind of specifically called out some options for addressing the impacts from embodied carbon. They did something interesting. They actually lumped together urban heat island options with the embodied carbon options. And I think what they were getting at was to sort of draw this connection between the one-time decisions we make that have these kind of lasting and ongoing impacts for the larger environment. So the first option is essentially a prescriptive option where you can get a point apiece for having an environmental product declaration for steel, for concrete, or for insulation, since we think that those are probably likely to be the, shall we say, worst offenders for a multifamily affordable housing project. Then come these two options related to the heat island, green roof and light colored or high albedo paving. And then lastly, a requirement or an optional credit that the wood in a project shall be either Forest Stewardship Council certified for demonstrating that it's been responsibly grown and harvested, or salvaged wood, and that's a requirement for 50% of the wood in the project by cost. So again, these are options within green communities and not mandates, but it was a, I think, positive change for the 2020 version in terms of addressing embodied carbon. So now let me dive into the energy specific programs. Energy Star, and I'll talk first about Energy Star homes or Energy Star multifamily new construction. This is suitable for either new construction buildings or gut rehabs. And then I'll also talk about the zero energy ready homes complement to that. So we've seen a progression over the years where Energy Star initially was very strictly focused on energy. And then they started to feather in requirements around durability and essentially even health as they started to incorporate ventilation requirements and requirements for low emitting materials. And that, of course, was part of their overall mission to do no harm, to make sure that we were not just tightening up and locking down these buildings in the name of energy while potentially, introducing building science failures or negative health impacts to occupants. So that was a great and positive and very responsible step. But unfortunately, there is still no mention and no place in the program for embodied carbon specifically. Energy Star for commercial buildings is based not on the let me step back a moment. Energy Star homes and the multifamily new construction options are suitable for incorporation during design phase, and then there's a performance testing phase and visual inspection and commissioning effort that happens prior to occupancy. Energy Star for commercial and institutional buildings, on the other hand, is based purely on benchmarked utility consumption and comparing yourself to ensure that you're at least 15% more efficient than similar buildings. But in the same vein, it's focused on energy and it lacks any specific attention to the embodied carbon impacts. One of the programs that's been increasingly popular, that's sort of an expansion of and complement to Energy Star for residential projects, is the Department of Energy's Zero Energy Ready Home program. Energy Star is run by EPA. DOE came out with this sort of similar, largely similar, but has a few particular emphases in it. And this was to really sort of try to get the residential market ready to be zero energy. So the idea was, even if you can't be today, that you're putting in place the appropriate measures so that you can be in the future. And it has some similarities to the zero carbon from ILFI in that it requires you to have even lower energy usage in terms of operational energy than other Energy Star homes, for example. So we would call that, it requires a reduced HERS index or a reduced energy rating index. It also requires Indoor Air Plus certification, which is another label from EPA that's available for residential projects, specifically focused on health. And it incorporates many of the elements of EPA's WaterSense certification for new homes and multifamily buildings. Not all of them, however. So you can end up with 2 or 3 or maybe 4 labels, depending on how you choose to pursue this program. And then most significantly, it requires projects to do either renewables installed or to complete a renewable ready checklist to make sure that they've got the components for on-site infrastructure, including an evaluation of the orientation and sloping of things like roofs, an evaluation of shading, and making sure that there is conduit or traces available for future installation, and that there's the structure present to support renewables in the future. But alas, we have no specific mention of embodied carbon in this program either. So the next one is Passive House. There's more than one variety of Passive House. There's Passive House International, there's Passive House Institute US. They run sort of competing programs. They have slightly different metrics, but both of them are essentially offering a whole building energy budget, and they require tightness and comfort criteria, among other things. I'm sure you all know that this is a growing popularity as a path to sort of near zero operating carbon, and has gotten a lot of attention, and really sort of, in a lot of ways, I think, popularized the idea of being really low energy, which was wonderful. There is no mention of embodied carbon impacts, and there are no specific materials requirements in there. So that is maybe one of the, I don't know, criticisms, I guess you could say, of Passive House, or that's just not the intent of the program. Another maybe criticism that sometimes comes up is that while the ventilation testing is strictly enforced, which is great because that's a big problem for occupant health if ventilation systems don't work appropriately, the ventilation targets are generally lower than some of what the most recent health research trends support. There is actually going to be more on how to do Passive House while paying attention to embodied carbon impacts in the next session that's coming up in this series. So I think that's going to be a great one. So let me just speak to a moment to talk about a couple of the healthy building certification options. The first one being WELL. This is something that was introduced by the International Well Building Institute, formerly, it was originally introduced by Delos and then taken over by that nonprofit. And it covers a lot of things, but explicitly related to the health experience of occupants in a building without any particular emphasis on energy efficiency or carbon. But what's interesting about it is that as it does address things like air, water, nourishment, light, fitness, comfort, and mind, it's making some, I guess, more abstract connections than maybe were made in green building programs in the past. And I mention it because I think it's relevant to start some of those conversations. So there's no explicit mention of embodied carbon impacts, but I'm going to talk about another competing program to give you an idea of where I see potential for some of those connections to be made. Well, you may not be as familiar with, it's not been around for quite as long, but this was something that was developed by the Center for Disease Control and the General Services Administration initially to address healthy workplaces for government buildings. It was intended to be a bit more doable with a lower bar to entry than WELL, and it was intended to be used as a way to benchmark progress, even if you weren't able to or interested in certifying. And it's available for different buildings, tenant spaces, and now also multifamily buildings. So this is where I see the opportunity to sort of relate the conversation about embodied carbon impacts to some of the goals. It's not there yet. There's nothing in there that explicitly talks about embodied carbon impacts. But they do have impact categories around things like community health, social equity for vulnerable populations, and even instilling feelings of well-being. And I think that this could potentially give us a framework to expand some of how we're thinking about this, because of course the whole conversation about embodied carbon is not strictly tangible. It's something that we need to kind of, expand our minds and think about very much the greater good in order to make effective decisions and to set ourselves new goals and actions. So if I were to continue my STARS assignment for embodied carbon, I gave National Green Building Standard and Enterprise Green Communities each a star because they definitely mention this, although it doesn't really receive a great deal of emphasis. And I did not award any stars to the others yet because they're not explicitly including those options. So before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to spend just a couple minutes talking about how we realistically approach embodied carbon impacts in projects that are seeking certifications or seeking to comply with some of these commitments. Here is broken down sort of a brain dump about what a process might look like by design phase. And this, I would say, is for a pretty formal approach. And then I'm going to give an informal, simpler approach as well. So depending on the complexity of your project, one may apply more than the other. So at the proposal stage, this is when you might start incorporating carbon snapshots with the integrated design workshop and talking about it with the client. In early design is when you'd be identifying the materials and components with the highest impact potential. Schematic design, you could assess with the lifecycle analysis tool some of the major structural combinations options and look for ones that have a lower carbon burden, and of course then you'd be evaluating the cost. In design development, that's where you might work with the BIM manager to select the specific materials and quantities and identify the bill of materials. Energy analysis would be important to account for how the structural elements might affect energy performance. So you'd be doing, of course, a balancing act between the carbon goals from operating and embodied, and then doing your assessment with a full LCA. In construction documents phase is when, of course, you would have specified carbon lean materials with EPDs and doing LCA again. And then in bid phase is when you'd be ensuring that the specified materials are actually going to wind up in the building during bid and construction administration phases. So how do we break this down into a simple approach, right? Maybe we don't have the project complexity. Honestly, for my residential projects, I am looking more commonly at a simple approach. So there are only two rules. Rule number one is start early. And by start, I mean we need to educate clients. I think a lot of the tools from Architecture 2030 are really valuable, whether it's the palette of materials or even just some of their graphics to drive home the point about why embodied carbon is important, because it isn't necessarily obvious and it is competing for their attention with a whole lot of other factors, most notably cost, first cost, and operating cost. So the conversation needs to happen early about ways that you can use lower carbon or better carbon sequestering materials, and maybe even to just talk about how you can use less material overall, because obviously the reduction is also a powerful tool, not just substitution. These were some of the graphics that I showed earlier in this presentation, but I think, illustrations are kind of critical to getting the point across to our clients. And then rule number two is, if simplifying means that you can get a project team to make a commitment, then I am all for simplifying. So maybe that means you're doing the simple LCA, or you're just focusing on the key offending materials with the highest impacts, or maybe you have to focus on some offending materials that have the most suitable alternatives, because perhaps for some of those you may not have suitable alternatives that are available, that you can afford, that are meet the team's criteria as far as being tried and true. In industrialized areas like ours, the three main materials that we're talking about are concrete, steel, and wood, but insulation also has significant impacts. So if you were only going to focus on a few, those are probably the ones you would want to look at first. But I also encourage projects not to forget about waste and seeking creative ways to eliminate it and not rely on just recycling, because of course that's still very energy intensive. If you wanted to have a really simple approach, I think what Enterprise Green Communities offered is about as simple as it gets, which was have an EPD for your concrete, your steel, and your insulation, and require that half of your wood is either FSC certified or salvaged. So that brings us to the end of this presentation, and we're going to have some time now for questions. I'm going to see if I can click through to the question box. All right, I've got one here that I'm actually finding in the chat that I just can speak to. What are your favorite tools to communicate embodied carbon to staff around materials? That's a good one. I would say probably my favorite tools are those that are coming from ILFI or Architecture 2030. And I think maybe I somewhat covered that already. I think we're going to see a lot more coming, but for now, those are some of the most, I think, powerful ones. All right, well, if there are no other questions, then I just want to go ahead and thank our sponsors once again. And I'd also like to thank our partners. And I want to remind everybody that you would want to go over to the chat to find the Google form link where you can enter your name, your AAA number, and your email if you would like the continuing education credits. And of course, if you don't have an AAA number, you can just enter the other ones if you still want credit. And then lastly, I want to give a plug for the upcoming presentation. And so there's going to be a much deeper dive next Monday, August 10th, same time, where you can learn in more detail about AAA 2030, SE 2050, and ILFI Zero Carbon program, and then the Passive House and how to do that in an embodied carbon responsible way. All right, thank you all so much for your time and attention this afternoon. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.